On to part 3 of Chapter 55's lecture on ecosystems. So we left off with this picture of an ecological pyramid, and this one is showing energy flow in the form of joules of energy. And as you can see, the pyramid is rising up to smaller and smaller levels from your primary producers to consumers, primary, secondary, and tertiary. And you can see you can feed fewer and fewer animals in each level. And the rule of thumb, again, that we use is about 10% of the energy is available for the next level, which explains these different numbers. This is just schematically showing you our pyramid. So when we talk about primary production, there's a few things I want to make sure you understand about the terminology. So again, primary production is the amount of light energy that gets converted to chemical energy through photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, basically being made by autotrophs during a given time period. And when we add up this total primary production in an ecosystem, we call it the GPP, or gross primary production. It's measured as the conversion, again, of chemical energy per unit time. So what exactly we're talking about is how much carbon is being fixed through photosynthesis. And again, that definition of fixed means how much carbon dioxide is being converted through light energy and the use of the plant's photosynthetic ability. How is that being converted into organic compounds like sugars? Now, part of that process of what is occurring is there is going to be a loss of some of that chemical energy. And so we end up with what we call net primary production. And that's simply taking the gross primary production, or the GPP, and subtracting any energy used by those primary producers for their own cellular respiration. So we've already talked about this a little bit in a lot of our classes about how producers also are going through cellular respiration when we were looking at eutrophication and how there is this need for oxygen even by plants themselves because they also go through cellular respiration. So some of that oxygen is being used to burn some of the sugars that the producers have made. So that's how we end up with our net primary production. And that number is expressed as per energy per unit area per unit time. So we use something like joules for meters squared over a year, for example. We can also express it as biomass added per unit area per unit time. So if we're talking about biomass being added, we're talking about the growth of the organism. So the growth of the plants is an increase in their biomass. And so in that case, mass is being measured by grams, and it's still per unit area, so square meter per year. The net primary productivity is the amount of new biomass added in a given time period. And it's only this net number that's available to the consumers now. So our primary consumers are going to be eating the net primary production. Another term that you're going to see is standing crop. And the definition of a standing crop is the total biomass of the photosynthetic autotrophs at a given time. So it's not the new biomass that's being added. Standing crop is actually the total biomass. So if you were to mass all of the producers in a given area, that would give you a standing crop number. And what they have done, they do estimates of this using satellites. And what they have found is that ecosystems vary greatly in their net primary production and their contribution to the total net primary production of the Earth. This is a picture showing some of that satellite data. So you can see net primary production, or NPP. In this case, it's biomass. It's kilograms of carbon per meter square per year. And the purple areas are the very low NPPs. So you can see our oceans are not as productive. And the very high being that reddish color that you see in very few places. But you can see there really isn't a lot. There are some high production areas, and where do they happen to be? But in the tropics, across the equator. So another term that you might see is NEP, and this is the net ecosystem production. And that's just a measure of the total biomass accumulated during a given period. So the NEP is gross primary production, the GPP, minus the total respiration of all organisms. So in this case, we're moving up from just the respiration of the producers being subtracted out, but we're also subtracting out now the cost of just living, the respiration of all of the consumers in the ecosystem. So we're getting a measure of the ecosystem's available energy in this case. So in an example of this, I have a little diagram that will show up here. A plant has respiration. It's releasing CO2 to the atmosphere. And by doing that, it's reducing the GPP to the NPP, the net primary production number. And this results in a short-term carbon uptake. And then we have the heterotrophs who are eating the autotrophs, and they are actually going through respiration as well. And also, as they go through decomposition of litter, their waste products, and things into the soil, what's happening through that process is also releasing carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And that release and return of carbon back to that reservoir in the atmosphere reduces the net primary productivity to the net ecosystem productivity. So you can see, hopefully this helps show it a little bit better than my words are explaining it. But we have the GPP, and then we have plants going through cellular respiration. So what we end up with is our NPP. And then our NPP gets reduced to our NEP because all the other organisms besides the plants in the ecosystem are also going through giving up some of their carbon stores through either their own respiration or through their death. And so that's why it says decomposition there. And then there's actually a third loss that occurs, but we're not going to focus on that, and our textbook doesn't look at that. But basically it's just talking about when you get any sort of disturbance that also messes up the carbon storage of an ecosystem. So you could see from that satellite image that there is primary production in an aquatic ecosystem is not really as prolific as it is on the terrestrial. And part of the reason for that is that both light and nutrients are controlled and limited in a marine or freshwater ecosystem. And so the availability of light and nutrients controls the primary production. Part of that is the depth of those bodies of water prevents the penetration of light from going very far. It can only go through what we call photic zone of the ocean or lake. And so that's the only place where we're going to see primary production. So in terms of the actual availability of area in the bodies of water versus the area that's actually productive, we have a big gap. More than light, nutrients also limit that primary production in most oceans and lakes. And the limiting nutrient is the element that has to be added for production to increase in that area. And as we were looking at eutrophication, again, it's no surprise to see that the limiting nutrients are nitrogen and phosphorus in terms of a marine's productivity. So light is the first variable to control primary production in oceans, since solar radiation can only penetrate through that photic zone. And I just wanted to show this diagram because it shows you how small that zone is in comparison to the entire body of water. In comparison, terrestrial ecosystems have their primary production regulated more by temperature and availability of water, moisture, precipitation. And the more water that there is, the more moisture there is in the environment, the more primary production you're going to see. So that's why around the equator you saw the higher levels of net primary production occurring. A term I wanted to define and make sure you focus on this is evapotranspiration, and that's the water transpired by plants combined with that water that's evaporated just from the landscape. So this is going to be controlled by precipitation, the temperature in the area, and solar energy, and it's also related to net primary production. This is on a local scale. The soil nutrients are often the limiting factor, but you can see here that water can play a big role in the availability and ability of production to occur. So on to 53.3. The concept here is that energy transfer between the trophic levels is typically only 10%. So we've actually been looking at this. But what I want you to see here is the production efficiency equation, which is the net secondary production times 100% divided by the assimilation of primary production. So this is a production efficiency, and you're not going to have to make this calculation, but you should just be aware that how efficient the productivity is in an ecosystem is going to depend on these two things. So secondary production in an ecosystem is the amount of chemical energy that's been stored in the food available to the next level in the energy pyramid. And so again, the energy gets stored as new biomass. So an herbivore eats a plant, it increases its biomass. The food has been stored in that way, or the energy is stored in the form of this biomass that is now available for the primary consumer or secondary consumer, the primary carnivore, who's going to eat the herbivore. An organism's production efficiency is the fraction of energy stored in the food that's not being used for respiration. So we saw a diagram of how energy is lost earlier, and this is really showing the exact same thing. But in this case, I just again want to relate this to production efficiency. So this is showing that there are 200 joules of energy available to the caterpillar here as it eats. But as that caterpillar is eating, it's actually going through cellular respiration. So right away, it's losing 67 joules of that 200. And then it's lost half of it to feces. It never was assimilated in any way. So that energy just went straight through. And then only 33 joules of that 200 ended up adding to the biomass of this caterpillar. So that is the secondary production number, is this small amount. That growth is secondary production. And so the caterpillar gets a